Los Angeles at the Compton Open, with Torres' own Louie Zamperini.
Louie Zamperini was just like any other 20-something's young man when World War II struck the world, but the thing that made Louie different was his speed. Louie had been running ever since he was a child. For him, it was an escape, a way to control his troublemaking and feel like he had a purpose. Louie trained throughout high school and early adulthood with one goal in mind: the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Luckily for Louie, despite only being 19 at the time, he was chosen to represent America as a distance runner, becoming the youngest runner in Olympic history. At the Olympics, after meeting Hitler and stealing a flag from his office, Zamperini came in 8th place with a 4-minute and 8.3-second mile. He was the fastest American, despite his opponents trying to injure him, even breaking his rib. After the Olympics, Louie started preparing for the 1940 Tokyo Olympics, but sadly for Louie, they were canceled due to the war. He soon started working as an aircraft factory welder and registered for the draft as a pilot in the Air Army Corps. On December 7, 1941, Louie was in the movie theater when the movie stopped with an announcement: the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. Louie was soon drafted and stationed in Oahu, where he flew in the B-24 Liberator, nicknamed the Flying Coffin by the U.S. bombers. Along with bombing runs and aerial attacks, the crew of Louie's plane regularly conducted sea searches for the crew of planes lost at sea. On a regular search for a missing plane, Louie and his crew, including his best friend and captain, Phil, crashed into the North Pacific after an engine failure and a simple mistake of a crewman. Surrounded by blood, fuel, and the wreckage of the B-24, Louie scrambled to inflate the life raft and to find any survivors. Only Louie, Phil, and the co-pilot Cuppernell survived. Injured and hungry, the three survived off of bitter chocolate bars meant to deter soldiers from eating them unless it was absolutely essential, half-pint tins of water, a set of fish hooks, a bit of fishing line, and signaling equipment including flare guns and sea dye. Every day, the survivors were attacked by sharks, burned by the sun, and drained from the lack of water and food. They counted the days at sea intensely, dreading the 34th day, the record crash survival time at sea. On day 33, the third survivor, Cuppernell, passed away. On day 47, 13 days past the record, the crew finally reached land, but not the soil they wanted. The crew had drifted 2,000 miles into the Japanese-controlled Marshall Islands and were picked up by a Japanese ship. From there, Paul and Louie were brought to Kwajalein, nicknamed the Execution Island. Japanese culture played a large role in the treatment of captured U.S. soldiers. For the Japanese, being captured was insulting to their family name, and they would rather commit suicide than lose their honor. This meant that the guards at POW camps believed that the soldiers were honorless and deserved to be dehumanized. At Kwajalein, the POWs were injected with an unknown solution in a regular experiment to test new medical treatments or new biowarfare technology. Most POWs didn't survive the Japanese experiments, but despite being injected with a full pint of solution, both Louie and Paul survived. Japanese experimentation, along with the experiments in Nazi Germany, was a major turning point in human rights and led to war crimes trials and crimes against humanity charges. After spending 42 days on Execution Island, the two were transferred to the Ofana POW camp. The guards made a last-minute decision not to kill the two after finding out who Louie was. Now at a legitimate POW camp, Louie thought he would be treated according to the 1929 Geneva Convention rules. He would be allowed to write home, given food, water, clothing, rest, and housing in a, quote, similar quantity and quality of that of their own soldiers. Instead, he was greeted by a secret interrogation camp with starving and beaten inmates. None of the Geneva Convention rules were followed, and Red Cross supplies were even stolen and sold by the guards. But soon came the worst news of all. In May of 1944, a message was sent to all POW camps. If there was any chance of the Allies rescuing POWs, the guards were to execute all of the prisoners. After spending months in what felt like hell, Louie was moved to somewhere much worse, the Omari slave labor camp, where Motoshiro Watanabe, also known as the Bird, was in charge. The Bird was a sadistic corporal who enjoyed physically and emotionally torturing the prisoners of Omari. He took specific joy in beating Louie due to his Olympic history and beat him unconscious multiple times a week. Conditions even without the Bird were grim on Omari. Food included dogs and horse intestines, causing the prisoners to suffer from chronic gastrointestinal diseases. The water contained human waste. The prisoners were forced to work as slave laborers despite the Geneva Convention regulations. The constant illness and physical beatings were beginning to take a toll on Louie's psyche. Prisoners were also forced to be used as propaganda for the Japanese. Trucks filled with fresh fruit were unloaded and given to starving POWs, and then immediately taken away after a photo was taken. Louie even accepted an offer to speak on Radio Tokyo, saying that the conditions were great in exchange for him being able to say he was alive to his family. After spending over 2 years in captivity, enduring permanent damage from his injuries from both the conditions and the birds' beatings, Louie returned home to his family. None of his letters had reached them due to the slow mail system and the bird burning his letters. He had survived, but much like many POWs, the lasting mental scars from the birds' beatings and the camp conditions couldn't be escaped. Louie suffered from severe PTSD, much like many other veterans, and became a severe alcoholic. Louie eventually became a Christian, gave up alcohol, and forgave the bird. The bird was no longer his monster, the book says. He was only a man. Although Louie was able to forgive his abuser, the POWs of America and other allied countries are still waiting for an official apology from the Japanese government. As for the bird, he managed to escape from prosecution and was never found. The treatment of Allied soldiers in the Japanese POW camps will never be forgotten by the public or the prisoners. Although many guards were never brought to justice, the Japanese POW camps, along with other crimes against humanity, led to the 1949 Geneva Convention, which helped protect the rights of prisoners of war. Louie's ability to forgive the guards who so severely abused him has inspired millions and will go on to inspire so many more.
I knew I'd forgiven all my guards. I knew I'd forgiven the bird. And I think proof of that was that night I didn't have a nightmare for the first time. And it's been 2.5 years, and I haven't, and since the war, and I had a nightmare every night. And now from 1949 till this day, I still never had a nightmare or even the slightest inkling of a nightmare. So that's my story.
It's amazing. Wonderful. Amazing.